Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this James Cooper Creston charity webinar. The subject this morning is charity trustee and management responsibilities. I think typically we often call this a webinar charity trustee responsibilities, but of course in the charity context, charity trustees and management need to work together. So if something is important to trustees, it should be important to management too. So my name is Mike Farwell. I'm head of James Cooper Creston's Charities and Education team. We've got a good mix of trustees and charity management teams on the call today. I think the good attendance probably reflects the fact that people do realise that trustee management training is really important in a charity context. So the webinar will take around 45 minutes. It'll be a real whistle-stop tour. You should see the slides on the screen. I've got my colleague George Burrell who'll do the slide turning. You should also have a facility to ask questions as well. So if you've got any questions, just pop those on screen and we'll pick them up at the end. So let's make a start. So in terms of the session structure, those of you that joined our last session on this topic, it's almost exactly a year ago actually, will recognise that the structure is broadly similar. I think we said in September 20 that the world had changed quite a lot since we ran the session, the one before that, and of course in the last 12 months it has changed again. We did talk about COVID-19 last time round. We've run various webinars on COVID related issues in the interim period, but we will sort of pick up on COVID as well as the other topics in terms of responsibilities, regulation, financial matters, risks, and we'll close with some of the key issues for charities. Those of you that have turned up expecting a webinar on detailed accounting matters, I think will be disappointed because we won't be focusing heavily on accounting matters, and I think charities need to see a wider world than just the financial aspects. So if we move on to some of the initial basic constitutionals, in terms of types of charities, many of our charities, certainly those of any size, typically tend to be companies limited by guarantee. More about those in a moment. There are many unincorporated charities as well, so maybe set up as associations and trusts, so they don't have a separate legal entity. But the vast majority of charities these days, and many of them, particularly the smaller ones, are set up as charities and charitable incorporated organisations, which is a separate form of legal structure. It does mean that rather than the company limited by guarantee, which is subject to Companies Act and charity legislation, the charitable incorporated organisations only report to the Charity Commission. And then finally, there's all sorts of other different types of charities, one of which, one particular type, charities incorporated by Royal Charter. So in terms of companies limited by guarantee, these are typically the charitable entity. Many of our more sizable charity clients will also have a trading subsidiary through which they might carry out commercial ventures. Quite helpful, separate legal background. It does have a corporate existence, so like other companies, there will be a memorandum and articles. Usually there will be members and trustees, usually the members and trustees, often the same people. And in terms of the sort of legal liability, the members provide a guarantee. Usually it's £1, so a sort of pretty nominal sum. And of course, as well as the memorandum and articles, the legal constitutional document, like other charities, inevitably there will be lots of policies and plans. So I often start these responsibility webinars, and I know that we have many trustees on the call, but just looking at a survey that was carried out in recent years by the Charity Trustee Network in terms of what the benefits were of being a trustee. And I think people are often reluctant when they haven't been a trustee before to take on what they perceive to be a potentially onerous responsibility. So you'll see the statistics there are very positive around acquisition of skills, etc. And I always think the key stat is that 90% of people actually enjoyed being a trustee. So it's great to be doing that. In terms of the general themes around trustee appointments and training, etc., Charity Commission is very keen that charity trustees do receive appropriate training and induction processes. Increasingly, charities of any size are carrying out trustee skills audits. So as a result of those skills audits, they either find they've got some gaps, which they can look to fill, Or alternatively, these trustee skills audits do sometimes uncover hidden talents that trustees have been far too modest to talk about. So I think it's worth doing. Other charities are also carrying out trustee appraisals, and just to see how trustees are getting on, whether they're happy with what they're doing, whether they might be able to contribute more. Typically, these appraisals are a bit more soft touch than they might be in an employment context, but I think it is quite good to carry these out. Typically, they're carried out by the chair of trustees, and I think it can often result in trustees making a greater contribution to the way the charity operates. In terms of trustee boards, I think it's good that there is some change on the trustee board, but not sort of wholesale change all the time. But it's good to have some new blood coming in periodically, and all charities need to consider the size of the board. I mean, I think for medium-sized charities, my own view is that usually a board of around 10 is appropriate, but I'm very conscious that some charities operate successfully with boards of 3, 4, 5, and then some operate with a board of perhaps 20 or something. I think sometimes when the board gets too big, it does get rather unwieldy, and sometimes you find there are some trustees who are not contributing a great deal. So something for all charities, I think, to consider. So in terms of trustee skills, you'll see here the more traditional sort of functional analysis of the types of skills it's good to have on your trustee board. We'll see later that there's over 160,000 charities in the UK. I doubt that any of them have the perfect constitution of board. In terms of some of the more important and harder to fill positions in terms of skills, I think many charities have found it hard to find trustees with specific fundraising experience. Also, in terms of philanthropy, having trustees who've got the contacts and the address book, that means that you'll be able to access funding. Sometimes they're quite difficult to find, but if you do find them, they can be worth their weight in gold. And as we move to a world where technology is increasingly important, I think technology is also important too. Moving on to personality types, because actually, in terms of having an effective board, it's not just about having the appropriate technical skills, it's also having the appropriate personality mix on the board. So Julie Unwin carried out this research again a few years ago, looking at the different types of personalities that it's useful to have on board. So for example, useful to have somebody who can challenge, somebody, a history holder, someone who remembers what's been done in the past. And people, of course, do change over time. So someone who was once an inspiring leader after a few years at the charity might end up being sort of wise counsel. So quite useful looking around the room just to see what personality types people fit into. In terms of, if we move on to the essential trustee, this is a document produced by the Charity Commission. It is quite a good read and is useful for both new and existing trustees in terms of this clarifying for them what their responsibilities are. Of course, the charity governing document is important, but ultimately the trustees are responsible for making sure the charity is solvent, well run, and that it delivers charitable outcomes and public benefit. But at the same time as doing all those things, making sure that you comply with laws and regulations. So not something to be taken lightly in terms of responsibilities. In terms of compliance, if we move on to the next slide, whole range of things that charities need to comply with. You know, there's charity law, the governing document, and masses of other legislation. And of course, the one most specific to charities is reporting to the Charity Commission. In doing these things, trustees also need to act with integrity and avoid any personal conflicts with the charity itself. So, you know, some quite important topics to consider there. If we move on to the duty of prudence and duty of care, so trustees need to act prudently, use charity funds and assets reasonably, and avoid actions that create undue risk. We'll see a bit more about risk management later, and to take care when carrying out activities such as borrowing or investing. In terms of the trustee duty of care to the charity itself, you know, you need to show reasonable care and skill, and it's important to mention that any individuals on your board who have particular skills, for example, in investment or law or accounting or etc., the standard that would be expected of those individuals when you're considering those topics will be higher. So if you're a lawyer, for example, and you're considering a legal issue, you will be expected to use your personal skills and perhaps demonstrate those in terms of showing reasonable care and skill relative to whatever the topic is, and that would be more than other individuals on the board who don't have those legal skills. As you can imagine, considering external professional advice is quite important for trustees. If we move on, in terms of delegation, I think many trustees and most charities of any size aren't involved on a day-to-day basis, and much of the detailed work will be carried out by the management team. So charities are able to delegate to the management team, but they do retain ultimate responsibility. I think the dynamics within different charities, do vary. I always think a useful expression is that trustees should support and challenge and have an eyes-on and hands-off approach. So making sure that the charities are doing the right thing, challenging what's been doing, come up with suggestions, etc., but don't get heavily involved in the detail of running the charity, which often creates frustration and issues in the management team, who as a result are a bit unsure in terms of what authority they've got to do things. The topic of whether trustees can be paid has been considered in recent times, and whether trustees can be an employee. I think it's probably, as a very general rule, usually trustees, won't be paid. There are a few exceptions where this might happen, and generally they're not employees. So I think generally trustees will be doing, their input will not be charged for, although of course they may charge expenses. If we move on to laws and regulations, I mean, if you ask, I'm not a lawyer, as you all know, I'm sure, but if you ask me to list all the laws and regulations that charities face, this could have taken up many slides on its own. There's the Charities Act, the Charity Commission, there's all the usual laws around employment, racial equality, etc., and the Companies Act, etc. In terms of ones that are very more specific, perhaps, and relevant to others for charities, one is the fundraising regulations, and the fundraising regulatory requirements are really important for charities that are heavily involved in fundraising, and that often links with GDPR requirements. Some charities, of course, may have very specific regulations that relate to their sector. So a couple of examples there. So if you're in the education sector, you have masses of separate regulations. If you're in the care sector, you'll have separate regulations there, and there will be potentially separate regulators there. So in education, for example, you've got Ofsted, for example, or any other inspection bodies that perhaps an independent school might have. And then care, you've got the Care and Quality Commission, which is an important regulator in that sector. So important to identify all the key areas of legislation that apply to you and take legal advice where appropriate. Now, if we move on to potential liabilities for trustees, if all that sounds a bit scary, I think the reality is that whilst trustees are ultimately responsible, they should have few concerns if they're conscientious and committed. There are very few cases where trustees are held personally responsible for actions relating to charities that they're involved with. And any cost typically will be met out of charity resources, etc. So if you're honest, reliable, etc., and follow appropriate guidance, the likelihood of personal liability is extremely small. We'll talk a bit more about charity investigations later. So if you do remain concerned about your personal liability and being a trustee, there are ways of mitigating liability. So taking care with major contracts, identifying the risks, and more about risk management later. We've talked about professional advice a couple of times already. Making sure that you've got clear delegated authority with the management team, so the management team know what they're able to do and what they're not, so they don't wander into contracts or make commitments that you as trustees would be unhappy with. Understanding the law, of course, as we mentioned earlier, and there are insurance policies that trustees can take out. Generally, they're not incredibly expensive policies, and they do provide some protection to trustees, although not if a trustee has perhaps acted fraudulently or negligently. So many charities do take out those policies. If we move on to hallmarks of an effective charity. This relates to a document that was produced by the Charity Commission several years ago. It has actually been withdrawn now, but I think some of the themes and the broad headings in that guidance are quite useful, and some of them particularly relate to the board. So being clear about purposes and direction, and having a strong board, clearly very specific in relation to the board. I mean, it is the board that should really be setting out the direction of the charity, for example. In terms of, move on to the next slide, in terms of other matters included in that document, how do the activities provide public benefit is important. And a theme that I think is particularly relevant over the last few years has just been the whole question of future sustainability of charities. I was speaking to a charity the other day that was just celebrating its 200th anniversary and hoping to be around for several hundred more years. We have a number of clients that we deal with which are over 500 years old. So it's a question of not just looking at the next week or the next month or the next year, but looking longer term to make sure that you are sustainable over that longer period. We'll see more about risk later. I think charities that consider collaboration are generally seen to be successful, and I think that's been a real theme during the COVID pandemic period. And again, increasingly in recent times, considering your impact on the environment is seen as particularly important. If we move on to the next slide, so the Charity Governance Code is a voluntary code for the sector. It's been out for a few years now, so it's not compulsory that you comply with this, but it is worth a read from the context of charity trustees. It sets out 7 principles which I think are quite useful. It's very much focused on the board and governance rather than the sort of charity activities as a whole. So quite an interesting read, I think, for charity trustees, and particularly perhaps the chair of trustees. In recent times, in terms of amendments to the code, equality, diversity and inclusion has been a big theme for the society as a whole in recent years, and that is reflected in the guidance in the governance codes. So worth a look, I think. Right, let's move on to some more specific aspects of regulation. So I've talked a few times about the Charity Commission. So there is an independent regulator, England, Wales, mentioned Scotland, and there is of course an Irish one too. So the number of charities has remained stubbornly similar over the last few years. I think there was a feeling after the financial crash over 12, 13 years ago that the number of charities might reduce, but it stubbornly remained around 160,000. In terms of trustees, there's around 940,000 trusteeships and around 700,000 individuals who are involved as trustees. So the different numbers there reflecting the fact, of course, that some individuals are involved as trustees of more than one charity. The average age of charity trustees remains around 57. So I think it is quite difficult getting younger people engaged with charities, and it does tend to be people in their 50s and who are perhaps retired, who've got more time, who are often charity trustees. But it's great, I think, if you can get younger people involved with charities. So over 1 million employees work for charities, 6 million volunteers, some huge numbers in terms of income and investment. But one of the interesting themes in the numbers is that actually there's a huge number of quite small charities. So of those 169,000, well over 100,000 have income under 25,000. And only around about 10,000 have got income over 1 million. So, and then if you look at charities getting on the larger side, you've only got 2,400 over 5 million. So lots of quite small charities around. And the Charity Commission also produces some really useful guides and videos which can help trustees. In terms of the Commission itself, in over the last decade, it has received some criticism. It's had its funding reduced. It does carry out investigations and responds to serious incidents. I mean, I think it's a great organisation, and they certainly has many committed individuals working within it. But time pressures, like all of us, in terms of what they are able to do. So sometimes the response times from the Commission can be slower than one might want. In terms of what the Commission is worried about, I mean, you'll see this as a theme throughout the rest of the presentation. I suppose the four key ones I think that many people would assess would be reputation. So they're concerned about the reputation as the sector as a whole. And of course, that's made up of individual charity reputations. So I think problems at individual charities can create problems for the sector as a whole. Issues around safeguarding values and behaviours are important. Financial resilience has been a big theme in recent years, and certainly that's been drawn more into focus during the COVID-19 period. Although it has been amazing how resilient so many charities have been during that COVID period. More of that later. In terms of public benefit, which I've mentioned a couple of times, there's a number of charitable purposes, quite an interesting area. The Charity Commission do sometimes refuse registration to organisations trying to become a charity because they don't feel it's providing appropriate public benefit. One of the key issues there is the ability to pay. So that would be an example, for example, in the context perhaps of care home, or big focus around 10 years ago on independent schools in terms of ability to pay. So we have seen many independent schools in terms of demonstrating their public benefit, providing bursaries and other offers to allow people who might not otherwise be able to attend those schools to actually do so. So quite a big theme, really up to individual charities to make their decisions on that, and some useful Charity Commission guidance is available. In terms of investigations, move on to the next slide. The Commission these days often responds to serious incidents reported by charities, whistleblowing, matters reported by independent examiners and auditors, and the types of things they focus on, naturally anything that involves criminal activity. If you look at the cases they investigate, there's often themes around trustees. Are the trustees not being involved enough or being too involved? They're always worried about financial controls of vulnerable beneficiaries. And in recent decades, things to do with terrorism have been quite a focus. Around general election time, we see lots of issues around political activity and campaigning, etc. And naturally, anything to do with money laundering, they will be interested in. So that's generally how they operate, but they're very much relying on intelligence they gain from others. In terms of investments, charities that are fortunate to have investments need to have an investment policy. They need to consider how they hold those investments in terms of the capital that's generated, the income that's generated. This is a real key areas using external advisors, so using investment managers, diversifying portfolios. A big theme in recent times has been ethical investment, often called ESG, environmental, social and governance, and many charities are looking quite closely at that with their advisors, so making sure they're not investing in things they consider appropriate, whether that might be arms, for example, or alcohol, and looking at this balance between maximising return and sort of the ethical stance, which can be quite tricky. In terms of property, many charities have significant property holdings, either that they're using operationally or from an investment perspective. So some quite tricky rules there around property. Naturally, it's up to charities to make sure they maintain and take insurance. And it's a real key area for taking appropriate professional advice from property professionals. For example, if you're considering an acquisition or a disposal or creating a charge on your property, to borrow some money, it is really vital that you get appropriate professional advice to make sure that you are doing the right thing. In terms of tax, on the next slide, people often say charities don't pay tax. As with most things, it's not quite as straightforward as that, and there are particular issues, potential issues around charities that might get involved in some trading and non-charitable activities, and the topic of VAT is often really quite complex in a charitable context. In terms of, but having said that, there are many reliefs that are available. In terms of numbers, probably the biggest reliefs, two of the biggest reliefs that charities get will be around gift aid and rates relief, but many other sources of income, for example, typically land and property, and many of the charitable activities that are carried out, and there's no tax to be paid on the surplus there. And there are also reliefs from capital gains tax and stamp duty, land tax. There's been some debate about whether business rates relief might be withdrawn from independent schools, but we'll wait and see. I think that has happened in Scotland So the subject of tax in charities can be quite complex. Some of these issues can be got around by the use of trading subsidiaries. So if we move on to the next slide. So often charities will put commercial ventures through here. You can donate any surplus profits to the charity without paying tax using a gift aid mechanism. Sometimes you can recover VAT. There are some challenges, of course, with these trading subsidiaries because the Charity Commission doesn't like charities funding trading entities, even if it's an entity that they control 100%, and making sure you've got the right board and that you allocate costs appropriately. So, worth considering if you're looking at substantial trading activities. And I think many charities have, supported their charitable activities by getting involved in commercial ventures over the years. In terms of finance, move on to the next slide. So key areas: controls, management, accounting, annual accounts and reserves. So we'll spend a few minutes just looking at those. So if we move on to financial control, so important to protect, everyone really involved with the charity, whether beneficiaries, employees, or trustees. Again, primary responsibility with trustees, and we're looking at hopefully minimising the chance of fraud, but not just fraud, but potential error as well. In terms of management accounting, this will, on the next slide, this will vary according to the type and size of charity. So usually it's good practice, for example, to set budgets. Management accounts are quite useful in charities of any size. Sometimes monthly is appropriate, sometimes quarterly, or in an educational context of school terms, for example. Some schools produce their management accounts on a termly basis. Make sure that those accounts have commentary to explain variances between what's happened and the budget, and take action to deal with that. And of course, increasingly looking at forecast, and I think forecasting has been a big theme in recent times with COVID. People have been looking at what might happen, different scenarios, etc. Then, of course, in the charity context, one also has to look at fund accounting and splitting funds between unrestricted general charitable funds and any restricted funds that you may have received for a particular purpose. In terms of annual reporting, so generally annual reporting requirement, the charity accounting rules laid out in the statement of recommended practice, and that's been reviewed at the moment. I'm sitting on one of the Charity Commission committees that's involved with that. It's a very long, drawn-out process. I think it's taking about 4 years. I suspect when the final document is produced, we will see some evolutionary change rather than revolutionary change. But of course, one of the issues that is being considered is the question of whether the rules should be slightly less onerous for some smaller charities. So there may potentially be some release available there. In terms of charity audits, there's a very general rule. Charities have to have an audit if their income's over £1 million, and there's a trustees report in the accounts, and the question of looking at going concern. In terms of reserves, requirement of the Charity Commission that charities look at reserves. I mentioned earlier on charities that have been around for over 500 years. So, important if you're looking long term that you do have reserves to withstand those inevitable ups and downs that come on the journey of any organisation. Some charities, of course, have got huge levels of reserves. I often quote the RNLI, which has massive reserves, been so successful in fundraising over the years. But of course, a fundraising charity like the RNLI has suffered quite a bit over the last 18 months as it hasn't been able to carry out the usual fundraising events. So, perhaps a real demonstration of a charity that has needed reserves to get through difficult periods. So at one end of the scale, you might have organisations like that, or incredibly well-endowed charities. But at the other end of the scale, you've got charities that are struggling to pay the pay bill every month. In the ideal world, I think charities would be somewhere in the middle. So reasons to hold reserves to deal with those ups and downs, and also in terms of investment for the future. Often charity reserves are tied up in fixed assets, and one needs to consider that. One of the hardest bits about reserves is to work out what level of reserves should be. Often it's a range. People often use as a default 3 to 6 months of operating expenditure, but personally I don't think that's helpful as a general rule for all charities, and one needs to consider what the risks are in a particular charity context. I've mentioned restricted funds. Charities may also look to designate funds for particular purposes. And I think the whole question of reserves is around improving resilience for charities to make sure that you are sustainable longer term. One particular financial matter that's come increasingly to the fore in recent years, and this of course relates not just to charities but to other organisations, is the question of cybersecurity. Big concern of the Charity Commission. Of course, the fraudsters are becoming increasingly sophisticated. They become hard to spot. So making sure that you have an appropriate counter-fraud culture in your charity and that people are aware and skeptical of things. And it's important that the board sets the tone, make sure that people are aware of this and that appropriate training is provided. One of the key aspects is guarding against excessive trust and complacency. If you're, hopefully this won't happen, but if you're in the unfortunate position of being subject to fraud, it's a question of making sure that you report to the Charity Commission and to action fraud. So some of the key issues relating to this will be segregation of duties between individuals, easier said than done in a small charity, making sure you haven't got people signing off either electronically or physical checks, on a sole signatory basis. Make sure you've got some controls there. Be very careful about supplier details. So, receiving a notification from a supplier about a change of bank account is something that needs to be checked very thoroughly. And of course, ransomware attacks, can be really debilitating for charities and other organisations. So I think this is another area where, some external input is really useful. Even in larger charities, it's quite useful to get some, external input to look at how you're dealing with cybersecurity and protecting yourself and reducing the risk of this happening. So in terms of risk management, so strong emphasis on this in recent years. In terms of a whole range of potential risks can happen. I've listed 5 categories there of the types of risks that can happen. So an example of a financial risk, relatively obvious, reduced income, for example. Governance risk would be a risk around having inappropriate, skilled board and senior management. Operational risk would be, something like safeguarding, for example. External risk, all sorts of things happening in the outside world that may have an impact on your charity. I suppose COVID-19 is perhaps an example of that. And then just compliance with all the myriad of laws and regulations and making sure you comply with all the new ones. And I've listed there, just because I'm really on a campaign to emphasise some of the key risks for charities, the 4 issues that I referred to earlier. So COVID-19, financial resilience, reputation and safeguarding. So how might you deal with risk? Well, important to set a risk policy. Sometimes there's a belief that charities aren't able to take risks. This isn't really strictly true. Charities can take risks. It's a question of making sure that they take appropriate risks. So you might be, if you're a charity with no reserves whatsoever, you're perhaps going to be a bit more reluctant to take risks than a charity that perhaps is a bit bigger, does have some reserves, so can take appropriately considered risks in terms of new ventures, for example. So you need to assess the risk. Many of you involved with larger charities will be familiar with the scoring systems that people often use in terms of the impact of a risk happening and the likelihood of it happening. You need to consider how you can reduce those risks. There used to be the case that many charities would only really look at risk management on an annual basis. I think that really isn't enough as the world changes very quickly. I think we've seen many great examples, particularly, for example, in a school context, of COVID-19 risk management. Many charities have had a separate COVID-19 risk register, which they were changing on a daily or weekly basis in response to the changing external environment and changing government guidance. You need to clarify who's responsible for the register and risk assessment. I mean, clearly, ultimately, it's the board, but I think in terms of things like operational risks, it's important to have people on the ground responsible for those risks, and making sure that it's addressed by an appropriate committee. Some charities consider risks at every trustee meeting. So if we move on to COVID-19, so we've done a number of webinars on COVID-19 over the last 18 months. And so to degree this section, some of it will be historical and some of it will be looking forwards, because I think many people are now looking at what the world post-COVID will look like. I think as a general rule, it's fair to say the sector has been incredibly resilient, and perhaps more resilient than people might have anticipated at the back end of March last year when the pandemic started. Obviously, that's been helped by some of the government support. There's been a huge issue in terms of keeping people safe and operational challenges at many charities. Again, I mean, an obvious example of that is in the school context, where there was an incredibly difficult operational year last year. Many charities have moved activities online with varying degrees of success. We've seen meetings and AGMs held virtually, and it's been quite interesting to see that the attendance at these meetings has been much higher than it was previously. Perhaps the lack of other potential activities for people and the absence of travelling time has allowed that. We've seen a huge increase in collaborative working, perhaps not quite so many mergers as one might have expected, but charities working with the private sector, working with the government sector, working with other charities to achieve better outcomes for their beneficiaries. We have seen some reduced income, so charities, particularly those reliant on fundraising, events, rental of property, for example, have seen reduced income, but many charities have managed to keep income sources up. So many charities, that may be through emergency type appeals. So we have seen many charities who've actually made a higher surplus during the COVID period than previously, albeit that perhaps their charitable impact has been limited because they haven't been able to spend money. So some quite interesting things, and we haven't seen too many charities go under, and certainly the survey that we carried out with our Preston colleagues across the UK indicated that charities, were quite resilient. Investment values, took a big hit back in March 20. I think the general view is that generally investment values have recovered substantially since then. There are some complications around accounting and reporting, but really they're relatively straightforward, I think. And I think just closing in terms of the history of COVID, financial resilience, I think the sector has been incredibly resilient. So if we move on to what the world might look at post-COVID, or the new normal, as some people call it, looking at what lessons have been learned, I think we're seeing there has been a bit of a pent-up demand and beneficiary needs. So, there may be individuals who were reluctant to use a helpline or reluctant to leave their home, etc., during this period. So there will be some pent-up demand there. And I think particularly, there's quite a few well-documented sort of mental health issues arising from COVID. So charities in that sector will have a demand. I think we are seeing that charities will be including future pandemics on their risk registers. There'll be some interesting challenges about meetings in the future. Some people love online meetings, some people hate them. Whether it's possible to run a mix of online and face-to-face meetings. I think we're seeing increased reliance on technology, whether that relates to providing support to beneficiaries or charity staff. So we're seeing investment there. And charities looking at new ways of providing services. I've mentioned the mergers and collaboration. I think we've seen more flexible working in terms of charity employees being able to work at home more and less travel. I think we've seen charities that are involved with international assistance, obviously not able to travel, so they've had to find other ways of doing things. I've mentioned the active risk management that we've seen, and that's been a great example and perhaps relevant if any sort of crises happen in the future, but I think also of more general relevance to risk management for charities. And then looking at financial resilience, I think many charities have taken confidence from the fact that they have withstood the challenges of the pandemic. I think many have withstood it far better than I think they might have anticipated. And whilst hopefully we won't have any other similar incidents in the future, I think charities will take some confidence. So if we move on to key issues for charities, this is a long list and almost a checklist of things that you might want to look at. Now, I've mentioned a number of these already. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have spotted my top 4 risks listed in 1, 2, 3, 4 on that bullet. I think we're seeing charities looking at fundraising income. So charities looking at legacy marketing, for example, to make sure that they maximise the likelihood of legacies in the future. If we move on to the next slide, increasing requirement to document policies. I think, if something does go wrong at a charity, the first thing people do is ask to see what the policy was. I think we're seeing some tax changes, so the national insurance changes will impact on charity costs, and I think we will see some increases in potential increases in salaries. I think we're seeing the more fortunate charities who have substantial reserves, and many of them have been using those reserves during COVID period to support their beneficiaries. I mean, because after all, people say you hold reserves for a rainy day. Well, I think certainly the last 18 months probably constitutes a rainy day. Increasingly these days, like in the corporate sector, we're seeing issues around recruitment and retention and staff shortages. I think, if you speak to charities, as indeed corporate entities, I think, recruiting and having the right staff is important. So a particular example of staff shortages would be charities in the care sector, where there are some well-documented, a huge number of vacancies in that sector. If we move on to the final slide in terms of key issues, so social media, probably I'm not the best person to ask about that, but certainly many charities are using it successfully. Charities also reviewing strategy on a regular basis, reviewing scenarios, what happens if we lose that source of income, what happens if that happens, etc. Just to give themselves confidence that they would know what to do if something happened. And down towards the bottom of that list, big themes for charities at the moment and into the future will be the wider society issues around equality, diversity and inclusion, and also, of course, climate change, which is a good way of engaging with young people. And I think we are increasingly seeing in charities making funding applications that they are being asked more questions about policies in both these areas. So it's important to make sure, hopefully you think these things are important in any case, but I think often from a funding application, making sure and demonstrating what you're doing about equality, diversity, inclusion and climate change are important. So really a huge range of issues for charities. So a question of maintaining relevance in a changing world and being flexible in dealing with them. So just finally, before we move on to any questions, I mean, if you are looking at new ventures, here's a sort of framework for looking at them in terms of the types of issues that you need to cover. So a whole range of things beyond just sort of financial aspects. And then if you're looking at mergers and collaboration, potential response, move on to the next slide, potential response to hard times. But I think everyone's been surprised at how few mergers there have been over the last decade or so. But it may be that there haven't been the mergers, but there has been the huge levels of collaboration. So you don't see too many charities these days who operate in complete isolation from other charities. And I think this really helps maximise benefits for their beneficiaries. The Charity Commission is quite keen on mergers. I think it's fair to say they find it quite challenging, monitoring 169,000 charities. But it's not really up to them to stop people setting up new appropriate charities. But I think they do see some benefits. For some of the big challenges around mergers is just the whole independence issue. And I think by collaborating, charities are able to maintain their independence but still create an impact. Potential benefits from mergers and collaborations, reduce costs potentially, improve quality of resource. It perhaps reduces your risk if you're carrying out a venture with somebody else, and similarly, a lower requirement for reserves. You may be able to draw upon the expertise of the other charities for advice, give a really coordinated approach, and manage the whole process more effectively. So I think we're now at 44 minutes. So it's time for questions. Georgia, have we had any questions that have come through?
Yes, we've had a couple, so we can just go through those now. Let's do this first one. Are you seeing more charities doing impact reports?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think we are. I mean, all charities typically have to produce annual accounts and a trustees report every year. But whilst we accountants and auditors love these reports, they aren't necessarily the best way of communicating what the charity's done. So we've mentioned public benefit a couple of times during the session. So I think, you know, an impact report, you know, is a really good way of demonstrating the impact that you've had on your beneficiaries. So these documents are, and often they're produced electronically rather than sort of expensive hard copy printed documents. So they would include statistics, you know, the number of beneficiaries that you've helped, the number of calls to a helpline, for example. And I think case studies of individuals, if you can get some case studies with photographs, etc., is a really engaging way of connecting with stakeholders. So I think, you know, impact reports are important. I mean, I think the whole way that charities communicate externally is important, whether that's through their website, whether it's through what people say, or whether it's through, you know, formal documents like the accounts, whether it's through impact reports. You know, it's important for charities to work out who they need to communicate with and get their message across in an appropriate way.
Thanks, Mike.
Any others, Georgia?
Yep. So what methods are charities using to find new trustees?
Right. So, I mean, it is a big challenge finding new trustees. I mean, the traditional mechanism that many charities have used has just been contacts of individual board members. But I think there is this does rather restrict the group. And I think for charities that are facing the sort of equality, diversity and inclusion challenge, and I think this challenge applies to the charities generally, but also potentially to the constitution of a board. If there's no younger people on the board, for example, if there are no people from an ethnic minorities, for example. So I think it's often useful to use a wider mechanism of trying to find trustees other than just networks, which, you know, arguably using your own networks, you may end up recruiting trustees quite similar to the existing trustees that you've got. So I think we have seen that some charities have been quite successful, particularly perhaps those in a large town or city. You know, just sometimes an advert in the local paper can produce us an amazingly high number of responses. Using social media, having advertised on your website can be quite useful. And there's a few sort of usually website-based organisations that can help you find new charity trustees. So one that I've often mentioned to people is one called New Role, who you know, supply typically generally better for slightly larger charities because there is a cost to doing it, but it can be quite a good way of attracting candidates from areas and with skills that perhaps you would otherwise struggle to find. Are there any others, Georgia?
Yes, there's just one more.
Yeah.
Are charities taking out insurance against losses due to cyber attacks, and is the cover available adequate?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that has been a real developing market in recent times. I think the early policies that came out for cybersecurity were a bit basic and not great, but I think we are seeing that the market is developing, and more people are looking at doing it, not just in the charity context, but in the you know, the corporate world as well. So I think it's definitely worth either speaking to your insurers about cybersecurity now, or definitely when you are reviewing your insurance next. I mean, as you know, typically the case with all insurance policies, there are always exclusions and certain things aren't covered. But certainly, I would recommend that all charities look at cyber security. I mean, I think you may well find that your insurers will flag this with you at the next policy update, but it may well be worth doing something before then. Okay, so Georgia, if that's it for questions,
Yes.
I'd like to thank everyone for attending. If you think of any questions later on, you'll see the contact details there. You're very welcome to give me a ring. The video will be available shortly on our website. So either if you've enjoyed it so much you'd like to watch it again, or perhaps more relevantly, if you've got any colleagues who you think might benefit from watching it, it will be available on our website, and it's also available on the James Cooper Question YouTube channel. So hopefully, if you want to watch it again or get someone else to watch it, you'll be able to find it. So just finally, I'd like to thank Georgia for her help running the webinar. Thank you, of course, for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.